We're here, we're queer, and we love the Lord. That's right, you're listening to Coming Out Christian, a podcast about life at the intersection of queer identity and Christian faith. This fun, faithful, and sometimes irreverent podcast is a production of Love Boldly, an Ohio-based nonprofit creating spaces where LGBTQIA+ people can flourish in Christianity. I'm one of your hosts, Siobhan Boyd Nelson, and my co-host is the Reverend Dr. Ben Hillscamp, Executive Director of Love Boldly. So join us, and let's find out who's coming out today. Well, hello there, Ben.
Hello, Siobhan. How are you?
I am doing so well. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Are we officially in fall yet, or are we still in this kind of weird time of like end of summer, beginning of fall?
Well, now, if you go by the solstice and the equinox and all that, then yes, we are officially in fall.
Good.
So don't bring out the pumpkin spice anything. I'm a person, I like to go by the stars and the rotations of the planets and whatnot. So I really don't want anything pumpkin related, fall related, until after September 21st.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I am a huge fall person.
Yeah.
So once we get a little bit colder temperatures here in Ohio, and leaves start to change, I'm totally locked in with the whole thing. Everything from pumpkin spice to jack-o'-lanterns to whatever.
Oh, I need to get some of that energy. I am a fiercely not fall person, which is somewhat of a hot take because everyone is a fall person, I find. And I think the only saving grace for fall is that my favorite color is orange. So I can find almost anything in orange. And so maybe that's what I am going to focus on this fall is just finding everything I can in my favorite color. That's a good way to deal with that, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Sounds
Sure.
good.
Yeah. We'll see. I'm guessing that our guest is also going to be a fall person because 90% of people are, but let's find out. I'm very excited to have our guest today, someone that I've heard wonderful things about, and that guest is Dr. Kate Common. They are the assistant professor in public and practical theology at the Methodist Theological School in Ohio, MTSO. They specialize in interdisciplinary research in feminist and queer theologies, biblical studies, ecclesiology, design thinking, and theopoetics. I hope I said that right. They are the author of Undoing Conquest, Ancient Israel, the Bible, and the Future of Christianity. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Kate.
Thank you, Siobhan. It's great to be here. Thanks, Dr. Ben.
So
I've been looking forward to this.
Oh, wonderful. So have we. And I can't wait to ask you a ton of questions, but we have to start with the first one. Every episode, we need to know, what is your testimony? Could you share with us your story at the intersection of queer identity and Christian faith?
All right, let's get right into it.
All right.
Skip the small talk. But I am a fall person. Let me just tell you that.
Yes, I knew it. I knew it.
But I am fiercely a summer person. So while I
good.
embrace fall, I am not happy to see summer go. And also my favorite color is orange, so I'm with you.
You
So
are
yay,
just,
okay.
yeah, vibing on so many levels. All right. Yeah, let's get into it.
Okay, so queer Christian testimony. Here I go. I was born and raised in Northeast Ohio, small town outside of Akron, Canton, outside of Alliance, Ohio. So very small. And I like to say I grew up in an ecumenical home where my dad was strictly Catholic and my mom was extremely evangelical. So well, on one hand, she said, the man is the head of the house, the spiritual leader, so we're going to go to Catholic church. We're going to go to Mass every Sunday. We're going to go to CCD. We're going to do all that. But we're also going to pray for Dad because we're not sure Catholics are saved. So it was, I was destined to be a theologian, I think, just wrestling with some of these things that I'm sure many of us can relate to. So yeah, that was my upbringing, and not a lot around queerness. This was the 90s. I was a middle school, high schooler in the 90s. And when I started to come to terms with my queer identity, right before that, my sister was dating a boyfriend in high school, and he came out of the closet. And I remember this was like one of my earliest memories of learning about homosexuality was my mom called a family meeting, and I thought someone died because we didn't usually have these family meetings. And like in a hushed tone, she was like, um, you know, Brian is a homosexual, but don't worry, he's going to see the pastor and he's going to expel the demon of homosexuality. We just need to pray for him. And so I think I was in 7th or 8th grade at this time, and I was praying for Brian. And I have all through my journals, God, please heal him of the demon of homosexuality. And it was just a few short years later where I started to realize I was really crushing out on a girl. And that was an inconvenient truth to accept. Um, and so I thought, where have I gone wrong? I'm praying for people like this. And so then I started praying for myself. I started thinking it's just this girl, like Satan is trying to trap me, all of those things. And so very closeted. And this was through high school, first few years of high school. And the worst part was this girl knew what was up, and she was a bit of a player. So I just got strung along. And then it was a very tormented time. But about a few years later, I had a really close cousin move to my high school, and there have been rumors that she was queer or gay. And a few months into our friendship, we had like known each other peripherally, but she grew up in Chicago, so when she finally moved back home, we became like best friends. And shortly thereafter, we kind of confided, like came out to each other, and we were like, "Oh my God," And so this created a really like we started networking then. Like then somehow we found each other, and so the next thing we knew, we would be having sort of these secret underground like gay get-togethers. And so this was, I graduated in 97, so this was happening in the 90s. There was no GSAs at my high school. There probably still isn't. Very rural, very white, very heteronormative. So we were kind of having this queer connection, and that was really, I think, life-saving for me at that time. A lot of my friends that I were meeting didn't have these hang-ups on Christianity, but I was still wrestling, really wrestling hard, thinking, this is wrong, I'm wrong. And it wasn't until I remember I got to college and I was like, you know what, I'm just going to date one woman, I'll get it out of my system, and then we'll move on. I'll repent. Like, what is it? Like, sin today, repent later. I forget, one of Augustine or someone said that. So I was kind of thinking that. And that went on for a few years in college, and then I was just still really having a hard time reconciling my faith and my identity. And I started researching this researching was like going to Barnes and Noble at that time, and anything I could get on gay and Christian. And enter my sister again. She was dating someone in college. He happened to come out, sadly.
Your poor
And
sister.
I know. But he was also like ahead of the game on researching queerness and Christianity. So then my sister became an ally, and he helped me like start to begin to piece this together. So we were again kind of forming this network of folks. And around a certain time, around that time, I came out to my mom, and she was really shocked, though I would say not surprised. The writing was definitely on the wall. And when I finally told her, she definitely freaked out and was like, this is wrong. The Bible's very clear. And then she kind of brought my uncle into the conversation, who was an evangelical minister at the time. And he was giving her argument points that, queerness is like being a murderer and it's a sin, and God doesn't, see a difference in sin, and sin is a sin. But we got to love the sinner, hate the sin. So really all of these cliches. But my sister and I were kind of tag team. and we would like sort of nascent theologians argue against them. And this went on for quite some time, but I would say during that period, I remember I was a junior in college and I was just so tired of thinking about this. I've been thinking about it since I was 14, wrestling with it. And my uncle was like, you know what, you should try like a seeker-friendly church. Like, don't worry about being gay, just you should get back into church. And so I ended up at a Vineyard church and just got swept up into the culture of it all. And immediately connected with the pastor. I came out to them and they were like, you know, it's fine. You know, we're not sure where we stand on it as a pastoral couple, but the church is against it, but we welcome you and we know you're gifted, blah, 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 blah. So during this time, I was not dating anyone, so that made it a bit easier, but I got invited into the leadership of this church. And I had this moment where I was like, you know, I've been really wrestling with whether it's okay to be gay and Christian. And if it's not, I'm risking damnation eternally. Because this was my evangelical theology. It was a very necrophilic theology, if I can throw in a seminary term. And it was really focused on escaping hell. And so I thought, you know, it's just safer. So, you know what? I'm just going to throw in the towel and I'll become not straight, but I just will be celibate the rest of my life. Because what's, 60, 70 years if you have a long lifespan being a single person, single lady, it's fine.
That's nothing. That's nothing.
This is my 23-year-old mind. So, and it just so happened that this ex-gay person started coming to the church. And I just went all in. I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to be an ex-gay. And I mean, if you know about the culture of sort of like Vineyard churches, they're always fundraising. They're always writing these fundraising support letters. And I mean, I was all over the support letters. They were saying, oh, people are coming out of homosexuality. We've got a young college student. They're an ex-gay. I was like instantly famous within this small culture. And then something happened like a few months later. And I was speaking with a gay friend of mine. And they were really excited. Like, oh, I heard you're at church. I'm really excited. And I said, well, I'm not dating women anymore. The church doesn't accept it. And I just saw this person's face drop. And in that moment, I heard that still small voice, and it was like, this is not the gospel. And I was like, oh, no. No. It was like the Spirit was speaking, and I was like, I don't want to go down that road. But, the Spirit, she gets what she wants sometimes. And she just kept saying, no, you got to relook at this. And I'm like, no, I'm happy. I'll just be an ex-gay. Everybody leave me alone. And it just was like this reawakening. And the thing that really sealed the deal was that my mom, out of nowhere during this time, said, the Spirit has changed my heart on the gay issue.
Wow.
One of the biggest miracles I've experienced in my life. And she said, I saw some kids being bullied. I saw 2 queer teachers, and I thought, they love each other like I love your father. I don't see why this is such a big deal, that it's keeping God's children away from God, away from the church. And I mean, it just, right as I was having those feelings, like it was suddenly like, okay, I really need to re-examine this. And you can imagine when I kind of came back out as an ex-gay, the church didn't want to lose their poster child. And so, at that point, the leadership had shifted. So the more affirming pastor had left, and the other pastors were like, nope, you either go back to, your non-sinful lifestyle, or you're out of leadership. You're welcome to come to the church. We'll pray for you. But, I had a role within the church for a few years, and it was just like, you're out. So that really started sort of the second phase of really reconciling and getting connected with more gay affirming Christians and communities, and seeing knowing, and it was like, I knew then for sure ex-gay wasn't the way. And it's like, I felt like I had to live all that. I had to fully be in that to fully then come out and say, no, that's not right. Because there was so much turmoil during like that time that I couldn't in myself and my identity and the resources that I had stand strong enough in my identity to be like, no, it's okay to be gay and Christian. But going through that and then having the support from my mom gave me those internal resources and the spiritual resources of feeling the spirit kind of calling me into this really more difficult position to come out and say, you know what, even at the loss of a community I love at that time and friends, deep friendships, this isn't right. So that really is what, at that point, I knew I wanted to go to seminary. I knew I sort of felt a call to ministry, to work towards making the church more inclusive for queer folks. I thought that meant being a pastor, but eventually that meant pursuing a PhD and doing practical theological work and doing the theology, the feminist, the queer theologies, thinking about the structures of church, beginning to realize that queerness wasn't the issue. Queerness was the way queer folks were treated is the much bigger symptom of like the patriarchal system, which is feeding all of this division, racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. Like the issue is way bigger. So I realized the scope of the call wasn't just, tweaking who was accepted into the church, but really looking at the structure and institution of church, the theologies, and the ways in which we continue to practice things that can, even if we're more progressive or more inclusive, we can still actually be undermining our liberative message with some of the theologies and the carryovers of institutional practices that we bring with us, which is why I do practical theology, because it kind of gets into that, to those structures. So yeah, that's really how I got started on my journey. And it's been a wild ride. I would never have expected to be where I'm at now. Like I couldn't, you just, you can't make it up. So, yeah, I'll leave
Wow.
that there. There's much more threads I could go down, but I'll see what sparks for you.
Well, that was quite a testimony.
Mm.
Your story has taken you to so many different places that are familiar and yet new, but also resonate in different ways. One of the things that stood out to me was the way that you were able to build a network,
Mm.
even as a young person, and to find those connections that kind of kept you afloat and moving forward. Can you speak to network? Because I also want to speak to practical theology. And if you could define that for our listeners, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here. And what your work in practical theology is doing for not only queer folks specifically, but marginalized groups within the church, and how we approach the other and the marginalized within the church.
Okay. Do you want me to start with networks, or do you want me to start with defining practical theology?
Start with practical theology,
Okay.
and then let's work our way back to
Yeah,
networks.
so practical theology, the way I like to think about it, and this is from my design background, it's kind of like the design aspect of the theological disciplines. And what do I mean by that? I mean, it's actually like getting in there and saying, what's happening on the ground with our faith? Is it getting the outcomes that we want? Like,
Mm.
so it's like, okay, our theology says we are open and affirming to all people, but our practices are exclusive in some way. Like, let's say communion or something, like not everyone's welcome at the table. Well, that's actually undermining what we want to do. So we might actually have to design a new practice. We might have to start to think about how are we practicing our faith. So that's one aspect of it. And so it's a creative sort of, let's try this out. Let's see, let's test it. How did this new practice go? How did this new ministry go? Is it getting the outcomes we want? Is it aligning with our theologies? And then the other aspect is like, what about our images of God? And this is where feminist, womanist theologians are really important. It's like, how do the ways in which we perceive the divine, language the divine, inhibit our imaginations, inhibit our welcoming of the other? And this can get real slippery and real subtle. And so these theologians that I build, I stand on the shoulders of, have done such great work of really looking at how we image Christ, how we image the Spirit, how we image God can really shape who we think of ourselves as humans, for good or bad. And so the easy one is like, well, if we're always just thinking of God as a white male, then white male is God. Like, that's how it plays out in culture, because how we
Yeah.
look at the divine shapes what we expect to see in the world. And so if we want to disrupt sort of white supremacist patriarchy, we have to disrupt that image of God. And sometimes it's not just enough to add, well, we'll add a female image of God. Well, if you've only been born and raised with one image, you add that little female image, we kind of ignore her. We're just going over here. We're still thinking of God in this way. So then we have to get creative. How can we disrupt that? What do we need to do in the church or in our practices to really reshape many of the ways that that our imaginations have been colonized, if you will, through the way the divine has been leveraged through really powerful colonial systems, if I go down that rabbit hole.
Now, I love what you're saying. Yes. And it sounds like very big work, because it sounds like what you're saying is some of these are practices. Now, practices are the things that we've been taught, that have been passed down, that are traditions, and they are things that I have found Christians to hold on to, just and will not let go of, to the detriment of themselves and the people they love and the church itself.
Yep.
So, what is it like to do that work of saying to the church, perhaps we need to do this in a different way? I mean, I definitely get it. There's a management practice called POP, purpose outcome process.
Yeah.
Right. And it's so you don't develop a process, you start with the purpose, you determine what outcome you're trying to get to, then you develop the process. And this sounds like popping church.
Yes, this is exactly what it is. And I teach a course on design thinking for leadership, and it's like it is strategy, it's design, it's psychology, it's understanding that, yeah, people don't want to change, especially when we start tweaking with where they've found deep safety, comfort, value, meaning in their lives. And you're just going to come in here and start shaking things up. Nobody really likes that.
No, no one really likes that. No.
Um,
Um,
but a lot of change has happened. So if we think, 100 years ago, women pastors were few and far between. Um, Queer pastors didn't really exist. Trans pastors probably, maybe there were some closeted folks, but yeah, it just so a lot has been shaped the ways in which. So churches are and churches are constantly changing, and that's one of the things I like to emphasize for folks is like we're part of a Christian tradition. It's a tradition process. It's constantly on the move. And so
mm,
we're all making iterations and innovations here and there, but we don't realize it. We think we're just passing on the tradition as it was. But there can't be further from the truth. It's constantly on the move. And we can just get a little more strategic and say, well, do we want to continue to pass this down, or do we want to shift it slightly? And so, sort of awakening to the fact that we're doing that all the time, anyways, and maybe we can be a little bit more strategic, but also a little bit more like, hey, what's the spirit calling us to, and are we afraid to change? And like, maybe we need to do some of this work. Um, that's one side of it, and then the other side, and Dr. Ben knows this because his church actually utilized some of the practical theology work because I'm thinking about this question all the time. How do we actually enact these changes or pop the church, if I can use that? And so, one of the things that I developed in my book, Under the Conquest, at the end was like, these are great ideas thinking about how do we decolonize the church? How do we, take responsibility for the ways in which the church has been involved in violence? And how do we take real responsibility for that as Christians seek to heal that? And do it in a way that's actually change that's sustainable and spiraling. When we think about a healing process, you don't just do one little healing service or one little sermon series and you're like, okay, we got it. Especially when we're
right.
talking about hundreds of years of like colonialism, empire, racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, whatever. These are deep issues, and it's going to take 100 years to heal.
Yeah.
And so what I developed, and this was, out of that design thinking, was let's make a new liturgical season that's focused on this healing. And so I developed the season of origins, which Dr. Ben's church was the inaugural church to do this season last year in October. And it's a 4-week season that's fully dedicated to the church looking at its past, seeking to really look, name what's there, invite new stories that maybe they haven't heard, invite new voices, marginalized voices into their practice, into their readings, into their life, and then really seek to repair the harm that they're finding. So, it could be localized harm, it could be more broad, it could be individual, and then imagine a way forward for the church. So it's like a restorative justice practice that
Yeah.
I bring into, or I invite churches to bring into their yearly liturgy and return to it every year so that this healing can start to take place over 10, 20, 50 years as a community. And in 10 years, people will be like, oh, we've always been doing this. But it's that kind of innovation that invites folks to change in a way that's not totally upending the tradition, but sort of inviting something new that they can get behind into the tradition that still speaks and connects to what they already value historically about the tradition. So those are some of the ways that I see practical theology as really important strategic work for the church right now, and trying to deal with all the things like that you were saying. Like, when people don't want to change, it's hard to do this work. But I think when we look around, if not now, then when?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely that. But I think it's people might be surprised to hear that there are people working so hard to do this work within the church, and hopeful to hear this, particularly queer and other marginalized identities, because what we hear so often from the church is a return to, or sticking with tradition, uh, you know traditional values, a
Mm,
return to traditional values is what I feel as though we're hearing from mainstream church voices. Now, I'm not saying we're hearing that necessarily from the church. I'm talking about the voices that we hear.
yeah, some of the people that have co-opted the narrative of what it means to
Exactly.
be Christian.
Right.
Well, I'm quite aware of that, and so part of the work actually, and the name is Season of Origins, and it's really
Right.
about saying, for us to really get back to our roots is really about liberation and the welcoming of the other. It's that
Okay.
simple. It's about taking care of all people, anti-empire, welcoming the other. So it's like it is actually a return to the traditional values. And guess what? Our traditional values are very different than yours, but ours are right there, biblical, and right at the origins of the Hebrew and the biblical traditions. And so don't come at us with traditional values, because
Right.
you're not going to win that when you really get into what is there in the origins of the tradition and within the gospel tradition itself. So part of it's reclaiming the narrative and saying, yeah, you're right, we're going back to traditional values. That's why we need to welcome queer and trans folks.
I love that. I love reclaiming the narrative, which is something that we desperately need to do within the Christian church. I was telling Ben before we started recording, I said, I am so excited to talk to Dr. Kate because of you do research in feminist and queer theologies. And I've been thinking and reading and listening to a lot more writers who are feminist or womanist,
Mm-hmm.
and thinking about what I learned from the church about what it is to be a woman. And I'm wondering, and so it started with the story of Adam and Eve, and there was a breakdown of the story of Adam and Eve that placed so much less blame on Eve than we traditionally get. When you think about patriarchy, as you were talking about, as being the root of all of these different problems within the church, we start with the story of Adam and Eve is the first villain. She's the original villain. She, was tempted by the snake, and then she supposedly goaded Adam into sinning alongside her. And when I heard that story told a different way and recognized just how deep the patriarchy is, it's right there in that initial story. What's it been like for you to do this research into feminist theology, and what are the things that you are trying to tell people about women in the church or women in the Bible that we don't know or don't hear enough, or that gives us this horrible idea of women that we so often get from the Bible or from Christian tradition?
Great question, and great to hear that you're kind of diving into that work, because it's so exciting when you get into
Yeah.
it. Um, I mean, I think after I try to take, when I think about history, when I think about the Bible, take a very long view and think specifically about what is happening at this location in the ancient Middle East. And what's happening is we're seeing kind of the rise of empires.
Mm-hmm.
In this region, the first time you start to see, 1,000 years or 2,000 years before the Hebrew people emerged, there's empire building happening. And these empires very much are starting to really move from smaller systems, and those systems typically had a lot of goddess imagery. It was definitely more balanced, and fertility, thinking about, what is it that people need to survive, and how to
Mm-hmm.
the divine helping them in that, to one of domination.
Yeah.
And if you are a society interested in domination, you're not really interested in the feminine. You're not really interested in fertility when you can just go in and take a whole village, when you can just enslave a whole group of people and make them do what you want them to do. Um,
Right.
and so the divine shifts to kind of a pantheon of warring gods. And
Mm-hmm.
and this is a shift that's happening in this part of the world, but you still have small people that are like just trying to survive and carrying on with their imagination of the goddess, of God, and so this is where the biblical traditions emerge out of. And so you can see the biblical traditions not having one voice on who God is or patriarchy. It certainly has a very dominating patriarchal voice and patriarchal God. You can find that God and find those sort of dominating images of God throughout the biblical text. But you can also find another voice, other voices that are saying something different. No, we shouldn't do that domination. No, God is like, a mother hen sweeping her children in. No, I mean, and if you really get into it, and if you really want to nerd out and look at what was happening in the Bible, the goddess was there, and she
Yeah.
was being erased. But very much likely, she was there in the beginning of the Hebrew people. Like, Yahweh had a consort, Asherah, and so she was there. And part of some of what a lot of scholars think is, as the tradition started to become more and more institutionalized and imperial and patriarchal, goddess had to go. And so
Mm-hmm.
you can, if you know what you're looking for, you can see in some of the reforms of the ancient Israelite tradition involved getting rid of things like the Neshutan, which was in the temple. Well, what was the Neshutan but an image of the snake? What was the snake? An image of the goddess. And so there's evidence there that we never hear about because we're told the patriarchal version. But ancient goddess figurines are prolific when you look at the ancient Hebrew settlements for hundreds of years. And so the goddess was there. And I think even when I read Adam and Eve, I hear a very different story. I hear a story of a people whose goddess has been stripped away and her wisdom has been stripped away. And that goddess is the snake. The snake is the image of the goddess in the ancient Near East. And when we hear the garden story, what are we hearing? We're hearing a dominating God that's saying, you don't get to have the wisdom. Wisdom's bad. And you hear the goddess saying, "No, the wisdom's okay. Eat the apple." And then she's killed for it. And Eve is then, and so I don't think that's the meaning we're supposed to derive from it. But if you can pick apart the symbols and if you can see what's happening, you can see that this is a culture that's wrestling with the loss of the goddess, with the loss of, and when I say the loss of the goddess, I mean the loss of women being seen as equals, women being part of an equal part of the tribal system. Empire doesn't need women to be that way. Empire needs workers, it needs, slaves, it needs women to give birth. That's it. It doesn't need women to be a part of the group with the same value as men. And so you see this wrestling happening, and it's much bigger than the biblical text, but it's in the biblical text. And I think part of our reclaiming isn't just is like saying patriarchy isn't really, it's there. You can find the patriarchal God, but is that really who we think God is? Is God really that? Is God this dominating God?
Right.
And if you think that's it, then be you. But I don't. I don't think God created, us and all of our diversity to be like, well, half of humanity is going to be oppressed and they don't really have the true wisdom and they should go back to being trad wives or whatever. Like,
It doesn't make sense, does it?
yeah,
For God to essentially have the mindset of half of this part of my creation is good and can lead and has value, and this other half of my creation has less value. That just doesn't make sense, really, as a creator. Even as an entity that is creating, it doesn't make sense to create things of different value, or that you would place different value on these things that you have created.
yeah, and I would say that's blasphemous. Like, if that's your image of
Yeah.
God, that's an image of empire God.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's, yeah. I'm just going
Not
to call it blasphemy. Let's go there.
okay. All right. There we have gone there. We have gone there. So your book, Undoing Conquest: Ancient Israel, the Bible, and the Future of Christianity, I'm guessing talks about all of this, about empire and ancient Israel. You've gone. I love. Can I tell you? I love when a pastor breaks out some Greek or some Hebrew. Let's go back there. Um, but then it sounds as though what you're doing is you're taking that knowledge of the ancient world and that deep knowledge of the context of the origins of the traditions of our faith, and then figuring out what the future looks like. So you're digging really deep into the past and doing some archaeology and using that to guide where our tradition goes in the future. So where is
Yes.
that? Where are we going?
Yes. Well, I will say this, that from a feminist and womanist perspective, so much of what we know is that change happens by looking at our past. And so when we find these liberative narratives, it's so important for us to lift them up and say, this is where we came from, because as meaning makers, as storytellers, we need that then to say, where are we going?
Right.
And so when I look at the past of the origins of the Hebrew people, which has emerged through 100 years of archaeology, I haven't done any of the archaeology. I've just presented a feminist reading of it and what it might mean for the church. It's that the Hebrew people got their start out of a really tumultuous time where empire was really just oppressing people economically, enslaving them. It was just a huge time period where there was just so much wealth inequality and
Mm-hmm.
really suffering. And then on top of that, the moment that that the Hebrew people emerged, we just learned in the last 10, 15 years that a climate change occurred around the Mediterranean, upending people, causing a refugee crisis, causing migration of people, causing like agricultural patterns to shift. And it's in this crucible that the Egyptian empire starts to collapse, and that people that were enslaved all throughout this region, not just kind of the Nile Delta region as we think of Egypt, but left empire to start new communities. And when I think of it, they built small, somewhat egalitarian, but more equal than what you're seeing in Empire, where women and men had different roles, but they were participating together with equal value. And that they just were like, we're not doing Empire anymore. And it wasn't an accident. They knew what they were doing. They were like, we're going to start new communities and we're not going to do Empire. We're going to do it different. We're not hoarding wealth. Nobody's better than anybody else here. We all have the same kind of access to resources. We're in it together. And when I think about today, that's an image for us today to say, okay, things have gotten out of hand. We have massive wealth inequality. We're dealing with the excesses of empire, if I can use that in our context.
Yeah.
And there's a real turn to the local of like, how can we build communities of care? Our resistance is knowing each other, is of seeing the other as part of myself and saying we got to work together to build a world we want. So it's not that the image is let's go back and live in the Iron Age and build like stone tools, but it's like, let's use the resources and innovation and community building to deal with the very real problems that we have around wealth inequality, racism, sexism, and climate change, access to resources, migrating peoples, agricultural shift, all the stuff that the kind of writing's on the wall for. We're going to have to band together. We're going to have to start working together. And guess what? That's why we have the Bible. That's why we have Jesus. Is because people 1200 BCE did that, and they said, and they imagined the divine with them in that process, and they said, you know what, God's calling us to do this, and so that's a non-empire God, and
Yeah.
so we need to get that non-empire God. We need to say like, this is who God is. God's calling us to work together, not dominate each other, not say who's in or out or which border is right, which border is wrong. There wasn't borders. These are people trying to get together and live. So this is a very real story for us today because it says this is what our identity as Christian, part of what it means. This is our story. This is our people. Uh, this is why we're part of this tradition. So it's, yeah, that's kind of.
Well, and I think we've worked our way back around to network. So we got there eventually.
Yes. All right, Siobhan. Here we go.
And so here we are because what we're talking about is coming out of an age of empire, dealing with a tumultuous period, dealing with all these things that we have seen, humankind has seen before, and we are seeing again that there was a move toward community care and reaching out to individuals and doing that networking that we were talking about earlier. Is that where you see the church going, or one of the positive directions that the church could be going right now as a way to address all of the ills that we're seeing?
Yes. 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 All right, we're done. No. um, Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and this is where, and I just submitted an article, and it's called Stages and Sanctuaries, Gay Bars in the Church. And I
Ooh.
really, hopefully it gets published. I haven't heard back yet, but I'll keep you posted. But essentially, I look back at my past. I hadn't quite thought of it about networking like you're saying, but for me, I kind of didn't realize what I had experienced during that time, that networking, how it really saved my life.
Mhm.
That this queer community, which wasn't without its problems and its issues, but fundamentally, it created a community of care, a space where we could be ourselves. And it's like, I've sort of been doing a retrospective on it, and I hadn't made this connection, so I'm really happy that you have, about how that connects to what we're talking about, in a sense that it modeled for me now what I see both with my friend group and then later in college with the gay bars and a lesbian bar in particular, but also a gay nightclub in Akron. That those spaces for me model what I imagine for church now, where and what I want church to be more of. And so I've come up with like 4 gay bar principles, and it's like developing communities of care. Like, gay bars really were there on the front lines of the AIDS crisis, doing testing, providing providing safe sex training, access to condoms, whatever. Like not churches, gay bars were doing that. Churches were doing the opposite.
Right.
Gay bars as a place of welcome for people to have their full identities. What does it mean for the church to fully welcome people, allow them to have their full identities? Gay bars as cultural and aesthetic creators. What if the church was, more about, creating new culture, creating all of that? So thinking about the resources that are in the queer community, the prophetic resources, and part of it is that I look at churches and I think churches are still central to culture, and gay bars are on the margins. And I wonder, how can churches do that work if they're still fully centered, and what would it mean to be on the margins? And some of it, I think, in this political moment, taking different stands, doing different work, puts you on the margins. That's a scary place to go.
Yeah.
But queer bars have been there. Gay bars have been there. Queer community has been there. I think of ballroom culture too, like with
Oh yeah.
and so
Yeah.
and what can be learned there, and the ways in which communities and houses were built for people of color, the really marginalized folks, no families, like
Right.
just there's so much there that the queer community has been doing, and queer communities of color have been doing that we can learn from as the church. And so I'm starting to piece that together just in the last few months, thinking about that. So I think that network theme really does run through my work, even though I haven't quite connected in that way. So thank you.
Well, I'm going to go out on a limb and say something wild here. What if the church was more like a gay bar? I think.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. There we go. Yeah. Oh, we've settled it right here,
yeah.
Dr. Ben.
I mean, we have, and we're 46 minutes in. Okay.
Yeah. All right. There we go. There we go. Well, Dr. K, I have taken up all your time. Ben, is there anything that you would like to ask Dr. K, since I have just hogged her this entire time?
No, actually, for well, most of our conversations, Siobhan, you take the lead, and I'm 100% fine with that. I think actually in this case, it was better that you asked most of the questions, because I've been ideating questions this whole time, but they're all questions that go back to Dr. Kate's research and book, and that are frankly kind of intensely theological and whatnot. But that's because not only have I read her book in the context of a class that she taught, I've also now read this book in the context of my congregation. And, I don't know a lot of it per se still, but I've read it multiple times in these different contexts. So all of my questions go back to like, okay, how can we connect book to something else we're talking about? So I think in this case, it has been better. We've had a fuller conversation because you're asking questions, having not necessarily gone through this either as a person in a congregation doing season of origins, or going through the book in an academic context.
Got it. But it is definitely on my reading list now. And
Oh, cool.
yeah, and are there other books that you're working on? You talked about this article. Absolutely hope that article gets published, and please let us know if it does. We will put a link to it in the show notes. What else are you working on? Because I'm very excited to hear whatever you've got to say.
Oh, cool. Well, I want to just say this about. I'll just say this about the book Undoing Conquest. I'm not sure if there's explicit queer theology reference in this. Feminist and womanist is referenced in it, but I want to say to your listeners, this is queer theology because it's seeking to undo, the hold that, if I can say, Western European white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, however we want to describe the dominating system that we're all living within, is what's responsible for these rigid gender roles, for this, heteronormative society. So it's like, to me, this is queer theology, even though it's not explicitly so. So I just want folks to know that, that to me, they're not differentiated. But the next couple books I'm working on are a bit more explicit. So I'm working on 2 books right now. One is called The 4 Marks of the Feminist Church. Ooh. And that should be out from Orbis Books in, I think, probably a year and a half. And that's really looking at all of the feminist and womanist and queer writings on the church of the last several decades and saying, like, in many ways, these ideas were almost too radical when they came out, and then they get skipped over, and then people keep
Yeah.
reinventing the wheel, and I'm like, let's just stop. Like, these people knew what they were talking about. We don't. It's not that hard. Like, let's just do that what they said 20 years ago. And so I try to distill the four marks of the feminist church, which I think I name as holistic, utopic, apostolic, and incarnate.
Okay.
And that these are sort of the key themes that show up in these folks' work. So that book will be out, and then the second book that I'm working on, which I'm pretty excited about, is called Desiring Utopia Queering Church. And it's kind of it's in progress with Fortress Press, and that will be me kind of looking at my experience at five churches. You heard a little bit about my Catholic upbringing and then the Vineyard Church, but then there's a few more like progressive mainline, predominantly white church, an emergent church, and then where I'm at right now. And the things that I've learned as a queer and feminist person in those spaces, even and thinking about how that shaped me both theologically as a person, but what wisdom is there for churches now as we're thinking about what changes do we need to make? How do we navigate that? How do we become more inclusive? How do we become queerer and on the margins? And yeah, so that's kind of and so that one's a bit more thinking about queerness in my own personal narrative. But the other ones, that's all infused in anyway, because scholarship's always personal.
Right.
But yeah, so those, and then the Queer Bar article should be out soon, hopefully. But yeah, so
Awesome.
it's been a busy season, and I'll just say too, there's a documentary that on the book that will be coming out soon. It's in progress, in production, and documenting some of the work on Season of Origins that's continued to develop over the past year. So just
Wow,
a
that'll
lot
be a
of
great
stuff
resource.
happening. But yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I'll be honest with everyone, Ben won't be surprised that when you started talking about the first book and the four marks of the feminist church, I immediately went to lesbian commune. So that
Oh, hey.
was those who know
Yeah.
me understand. Um, well, it has been an amazing conversation, Dr. K. I've learned so much. I'm so excited to learn more and to dig deeper into feminist and womanist theologies and to learn more about the goddesses and the goddess and the way that it is actually part of our tradition. So, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing all of your wisdom with us.
Yeah, this was great, Siobhan. Thank you, Dr. Ben. And who knows, maybe I'll see you at MTSO one day.
Yeah. They keep threatening to make me
I
come.
know. I'm like,
Now we
you
are
can be
going
in
to.
any of my classes. Come on.
Well, now I
But
would come and just sit in your class, Dr. K.
ah,
Don't give me that kind of invitation. But we're going to go into our two segments. The first segment is our query of the day. We are going back to our conversation when we started off when we started off the conversation. We were talking about fall and when it starts, right? So are you a person? Are you like, no, it's the solstice? We got to be September 21st. Are you an October 1st person? Are you the first time it dips below 50 degrees? Or are you, as soon as Starbucks releases the pumpkin spice latte? That is, I mean, there's so many different options here.
that is true.
When does fall start for you?
Um, Fall definitely does not start before September 21st. I'm a solstice person, but I'm also like in denial. Like, I can always tell, like, the air changes, like you
Mm-hmm.
can just feel it, and then I'm like sad, and then you get the hot day, and I'm like,
Yeah.
we are. So no, Starbucks does not control fall.
What about you, Dr. Ben? When does fall start for you?
Well, remember, I'm not a summer person,
Right.
um, so fall begins on September 1st.
Okay.
Hot take.
That is it.
Even though, yes, I recognize that it'll still probably be in the 80s in early September, particularly in Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but after my year living in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where fall just didn't exist that year, it's September 1st,
Okay.
and I'm going to start full on fall
Ooh.
at that point.
Got it. I
It's
can't
risky
start.
getting the flannels out then, though. That 80-degree day.
Yeah.
Well, I guess if I had to pick another date, it would be whenever it's cold enough that I can wear sweaters.
There you
Okay.
go.
That's a good one. Actually, mine's kind of the same. Mine is gonna be football weather. That first day when it's like the perfect temperature to actually go sit at the horseshoe, not completely sweat through everything, but you're actually just got on a jacket and we got a little breeze going on. That's when you know that fall has arrived, when you've got good football and chilly. All right, and now it's time for our moment in queer Christian history. This is our reminder that not only have we always been here, we've always been here in the church. What you got for us today, Dr. Ben?
So today I am going with an event from, an event from 1982. This was the year that Archbishop Carl Bean established the Unity Fellowship Church movement. Bean was a former Motown singer, openly gay minister, and the Unity Fellowship Church, as a movement, was really the first Black or African American LGBTQIA plus affirming denomination. Really, at least it had started working primarily with folks on the West Coast in Los Angeles, and this is 18 years before my own now denomination, the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, got started, at a time when we were also in the middle of the AIDS crisis.
Wow. So it was needed. We needed an affirming church in that moment.
Needed, definitely.
Absolutely. Well, this has been another amazing episode, if I may say so myself, mostly because of our amazing guest, Dr. Kate Common. Thank you again so much for being here. Please, y'all, go out, get this book, read it. I cannot wait. Undoing Conquest, Ancient Israel, the Bible, and the Future of Christianity. And you've told us about the upcoming books. We're going to keep an eye out for the article. Anything else that you'd like to plug or any social media you'd like to tell folks about?
You can find me on Instagram at Kate_Common, and my website is katecommon.com. So you can send me an email through there, and I'll be glad to be in touch with y'all.
Amazing. Ben, Love Boldly's having an event. Tell us about it.
Yep, we have an event coming up on Saturday, October the 11th. We will be welcoming Bishop Tim Wolf, who's the Midwestern Regional Bishop for the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries. Any of our listeners who have listened to, hopefully, all of Season 1 will recognize Bishop Tim's name. He was our guest, I believe, on Episode 10 of Season 1. But he will be here in Columbus. Come out with us to Stonewall, Columbus at 11 a.m. on October the 11th for Brunch with a Queer Bishop. He'll be sharing some stuff from his life, from his ministry. We'll have great food from Freedom a la carte. We only ask that folks, because of this event, does have tickets and has a ticket price, we do ask folks to go ahead and purchase a ticket via our website. Just go to loveboldly.net under the events tab. You'll find all the information there, how to register, how to purchase a ticket.
It's going to be a great time, and you get to support Love Boldly in the process. Meet Bishop Tim Wolf in person after listening to him on that amazing episode. And I'm sure it's going to be a wonderful time because he was a wonderful guest. So I cannot wait. All right, folks, remember to like, subscribe, tell a friend, listen to Season 1 if you haven't done so already, and join us next week for another episode of Coming Out Christian.
Thank you for listening to Coming Out Christian with Siobhan Boyd Nelson and me, Ben Hillscamp. Do you want to see content like this continue to be produced? Then please support Love Boldly with a donation and consider becoming a monthly donor. You can donate online at www.lookboldly.net/donate. Join us next time as we continue to engage with people who proudly say that we're here, we're queer, and we love the Lord, and we're not going anywhere.